The swelling on Gideon Marsh's leg had grown to the size of a man's fist. And when it finally burst open that morning, what poured out wasn't blood or pus. It was a thick yellowish fluid mixed with what looked like tiny fragments of metal. Pieces so small they could barely be seen, but sharp enough to glint in the morning sunlight. 3 months earlier, Gideon had first noticed the small bump just above his left knee. Working alone on his remote ranch in the Torridos' harsh back country, he'd assumed it was nothing more than a bruise from wrestling cattle or mending broken fence posts. The nearest settlement was a 2-day ride through unforgiving terrain. And Gideon had learned long ago that survival meant pushing through pain. But this wasn't ordinary pain. Each morning, the throbbing grew more intense, and the mysterious growth continued expanding beneath his weathered skin. What started as a marble-sized lump had become an angry purple mass that made walking a constant battle. Still, Gideon endured in silence, telling himself it would heal on its own like every other injury he'd suffered in his 43 years of hard living. The isolation of his ranch meant no one witnessed his struggle. His nearest neighbor, Boone Carter, lived 15 mi east, and their friendship consisted mainly of trading supplies and sharing news from the outside world. During Boone's monthly visits, Gideon had grown comfortable with solitude, preferring the company of his cattle and horses to the complications that came with people. As weeks passed, the growth began changing in ways that worried him deeply. The skin stretched tight and thin, taking on a sickly yellowish color that reminded him of infected wounds he'd seen during his army days. Sometimes late at night when the pain kept him awake, Gideon could feel pressure building inside the mass as if something was trying to push its way out. The morning everything changed, started like any other. Gideon limped out to check on his livestock, favoring his good leg while the mysterious growth throbbed with each step. The cattle gathered near the water trough, their breath creating small clouds in the crisp morning air. He'd just finished checking the fence line when a sharp tearing sensation shot through his leg. Looking down, he watched in stunned silence as the stretched skin finally gave way. The fluid that emerged was unlike anything he'd ever seen, thick and oily, with tiny metallic fragments suspended throughout. As it pulled on the ground, Gideon could see that the metal pieces were uniform in size and shape, as if they'd been manufactured rather than naturally occurring. But how could manufactured metal be coming from inside his body? And why did each fragment look exactly like the others, perfectly formed and gleaming despite having been buried in infected tissue for months? The strange discovery left Gideon shaken and confused. He collected some of the fluid in an old jar, studying the metallic fragments with growing unease. Under closer examination, they appeared to be tiny pieces of refined silver, each one no larger than a grain of sand, but perfectly formed into identical shapes. His first instinct was to bandage the wound and try to forget what he'd seen. But the opening in his leg continued weeping the mysterious fluid. And with each drop that fell, Gideon noticed something troubling. The metallic fragments weren't random debris. They were accumulating in patterns on the ground, as if drawn together by some invisible force. Boone Carter's unexpected arrival 3 hours later shattered Gideon's hope of keeping the discovery private. The weathered rancher rode up to the main house just as Gideon was attempting to clean the strange substance from his boots. The oily fluid having dripped steadily during his walk back from the pasture. "Gideon, you look like you've been wrestling with a wildcat," Boone called out, dismounting near the porch. His eyes immediately fixed on the dark stains covering Gideon's pants leg and the small puddle forming at his feet. "What incarnation happened to you?" Rather than explain, Gideon showed Boone the jar containing the fluid and its metallic contents. Boone's face went pale as he examined the strange substance, holding it up to catch the light filtering through the liquid. "That ain't natural," Boone whispered, setting the jar down carefully. "Nothing that comes out of a man should look like that." His voice carried a tremor of fear that Gideon had never heard before. The two men stood in uncomfortable silence, both trying to make sense of what they were seeing. Then Boone's expression shifted from fear to something approaching recognition as he studied the metallic fragments more closely. "Gideon," he said slowly. "These little pieces, they look like refined silver. Real refined silver." His voice carried a dangerous edge that Gideon had never heard before. "How long has this been coming out of you?" Before Gideon could answer, the sound of approaching hoofbeats echoed from the eastern trail. Both men turned to see a small wagon creating a dust cloud in the distance, moving faster than any supply delivery or casual visit would warrant. Someone was coming with purpose, and Gideon suspected his mysterious condition was about to become far less private. But how could anyone have learned about something that had just happened hours ago? And why did Boone keep staring at the silver fragments with such intense fascination, as if he'd seen something like it before? Dr. Silas Ward stepped down from the wagon with the practiced ease of a man who'd spent decades traveling rough country roads. His companion, a young woman with intelligent as in steady hands, gathered a leather medical bag from the wagon bed while keeping her gaze fixed on the stained porch boards. Mr. Mars, I presume, Dr. Ward said, approaching cautiously. I'm Dr. Ward and this is my daughter Clementine. We received word about your condition. His eyes darted between Gideon's leg and Boone, who had positioned himself strategically between the newcomers and the jar of strange fluid. Gideon felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. Who told you about this? It only just happened. Dr. Ward exchanged a meaningful glance with his daughter before answering. Word travels fast in small communities, Mr. Mars, especially when it concerns unusual medical conditions. A gesture toward the wound, but made no move to come closer. Might I ask how long you've been producing this substance? It ain't just any substance, Boone interrupted, his voice tight with barely controlled excitement. Look at those silver pieces in it, Doc. You ever seen anything like that come out of a person before? Clementine stepped forward, her medical training overriding whatever caution her father displayed. She knelt beside the stained boards, careful not to touch the mysterious fluid and examined the metallic fragments with scientific fascination. The formation patterns are unlike anything in medical literature, she murmured. These aren't kidney stones or gallstones. They're too uniform, too pure, Dr. Ward's expression darkened observations. Clement, step back. We don't know what kind of infection might be involved. His tone carried a warning that went beyond normal medical caution, as if he feared something more than disease. But Gideon noticed something else troubling in the doctor's demeanor. The man's hands trembled slightly as he reached into his coat, not for medical instruments, but for a small glass vial that he held with careful attention. Inside the vial, Gideon could see a familiar yellowish substance, complete with the same metallic fragments that were currently seeping from his leg. You've seen this before, Gideon said, the realization hitting him like a physical blow. You already know what this is. Dr. Ward's face went ashen and the silence stretched uncomfortably long before he finally spoke. There have been other cases, very few, and all kept strictly confidential. He looked directly at Gideon with an expression that mixed medical curiosity with genuine concern. Mr. Mars, I need to ask you a very important question, and your answer could determine the severity of your condition. The weight of those words settled over the small group like a burial shroud. Whatever was happening to Gideon's body, it was far more serious and far more dangerous than any of them had initially understood. Have you ever worked in the Silver Peak mining territory? Dr. Ward asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Specifically, the silver mines near Widow's Creek. Gideon's blood ran cold. 15 years ago before settling on his ranch. They spent 2 grueling months working those very mines. The pay had been exceptional, but the working conditions were so harsh that most men lasted only weeks before fleeing. Gideon had stayed longer than most, driven by desperation for the money needed to buy his land. How could you possibly know about that? Gideon admitted. Those mines were sealed up years ago after the accidents. Dr. Ward's expression grew increasingly grave. The accidents weren't accidents, Mr. Mars. They were symptoms. Men started developing growths just like yours. At first, the mining company covered it up, claiming it was just occupational injuries, but then the substances began appearing. Clementine had been quietly examining the fluid sample, but she froze at her father's words. Father, you never told me the Silver Peak cases were still active. I thought those were just theoretical medical studies because I hoped they weren't connected. Dr. Ward replied grimly. But seeing this, he held up his vial again, comparing it to the fresh sample. The metallic content is identical. Every fragment, every composition, it's the same phenomenon that affected 17 miners before the company abandoned the site. Boone stepped forward aggressively. Affected them? How? You saying Gideon's got some kind of mining sickness? The miners who developed these growths all shared one thing in common. Dr. Ward said carefully. They'd been exposed to a particular vein of silver ore that contained unusual mineral deposits. Over time, microscopic particles became embedded in their tissue, eventually forming these masses. Gideon felt the world spinning around him. What happened to those 17 miners? Dr. Ward looked toward the distant mountains where the Silver Peak mines lay hidden. They tried various treatments. Some attempted surgical removal of the growths. Others used caustic substances to burn them out. All 17 died within months of the symptoms appearing. So, you're telling me I'm going to die? Gideon asked, though he realized he felt stronger today than he had in weeks. Not necessarily, Dr. Ward said, studying Gideon with renewed interest. You're the first case I've encountered where the growth ruptured naturally instead of being forced open. That may have changed the outcome entirely. Before anyone could respond, new sounds reached their ears from the direction of the mountains. The distant rumble of heavy machinery and the sharp crack of blasting charges. Someone was working the mines again, and the timing seemed far from coincidental. The sounds from the mountains grew louder throughout the morning, and by noon, a cloud of dust was visible, rising from the direction of the old Silver Peak mines. Someone had not only reopened the supposedly sealed workings, but was conducting major operations there. That's impossible, Dr. Ward muttered, staring toward the distant activity. The mining company swore those sites would remain permanently closed after the health incidents. Bone had been growing increasingly agitated as the day progressed, and finally he could contain himself no longer. Doc, there's something you need to know about those silver fragments. I've seen them before, and they weren't coming out of any sick miner. Alas turned to Boone as he continued, 5 years ago, I was in Silver Peak settlement when a stranger came through selling what he claimed was the purest silver ever found. The whole patch of fragments just like these, and he was getting top dollar for them from jewelry makers and silversmiths. Gideon felt a sick realization forming in his stomach. Do you think someone's been mining this stuff out of people? I think, Boone said grimly, that those 17 miners didn't die from sickness. I think they were murdered for what was growing inside them. Dr. Ward's face went white. That's a serious accusation, Mr. Carter. The mining company has detailed medical records of each case. Medical records can be falsified, Clementine said quietly. Her scientific mind already working through the implications. If these metallic deposits are as pure and valuable as they appear, the financial incentive for exploitation would be enormous. The sound of approaching riders interrupted their conversation. This time, however, the visitors weren't medical personnel. 6 hard-faced men in mining company uniforms rode up to the ranch. Their weapons prominently displayed and their intentions clearly hostile. They led rider dismounted with obvious authority. Dr. Ward, you were supposed to signal us when you confirmed the condition. We've been waiting for your report. Dr. Ward stepped protectively in front of Gideon. The situation is more complex than anticipated. This man requires continued medical observation, not immediate intervention. Our instructions are clear, the mining foreman replied coldly. Any individual showing signs of mineral deposit formation is to be transferred to company medical facilities for treatment. Treatment? Bone laughed bitterly. Bone, you mean harvesting, don't you? How many other men have your bodies? The accusation hung in the air like smoke from a gunshot. The mining company men exchanged glances, and Gideon realized that Boone had struck dangerously close to the truth. The standoff stretched tense and dangerous as the mining company men slowly spread out around the small group. Their weapons remained holstered, but their intentions were clear. Gideon would be leaving with them, willingly or otherwise. Mr. Mars, the foreman said with false reasonableness. You're suffering from a serious medical condition that requires specialized treatment. Our company facilities have the expertise to help you. The same expertise that helped 17 other miners, Gideon replied, finding courage he didn't know he possessed. Funny how all that help ended up killing them. Dr. Ward stepped forward, his medical authority lending weight to his words. The patient is stable and responding well to natural healing processes. Forced intervention at this stage could prove fatal. Dr. Ward. The foreman's voice carried a warning edge. You're under contract with our company. Your medical opinion is subject to company oversight. Clementine moved to stand beside her father. My medical opinion isn't subject to anyone's oversight. And I'm telling you that moving this patient now would constitute assault. The foreman's patience was clearly wearing thin. Miss Ward, you're interfering with legitimate business operations. The mineral deposits in this man's body represent company property extracted from company mines. The admission sent shock waves through the group. Boone drew his pistol, though his hand trembled with rage rather than fear. Company property? You're talking about pieces of a man's body like there are samples? Technically, the foreman continued coldly. Any materials extracted from company mining operations remain company assets regardless of where they end up. Mr. Marsh signed standard mining contracts 15 years ago that included mineral rights clauses. Gideon felt sick. You're saying you own the silver that's been growing inside me? We're saying you were exposed to company materials during company operations on company property. Standard liability and asset recovery protocols apply. Dr. Ward pulled out his medical bag with sudden determination. Then let me remove the deposits surgically right here. If they're company property, you can have them immediately. No, the foreman shouted, revealing more than he intended. Surgical extraction damages the purity. The deposits must be harvested using specialized techniques to maintain their value. The truth was finally out. The mining company had been deliberately exposing workers to the silver-bearing ore, knowing it would eventually form valuable deposits in their bodies. The 17 dead miners had likely been harvested and their deaths covered up as occupational accidents. But Gideon's case was different. His growth had ruptured naturally, potentially damaging the precious silver and reducing its market value. That's why they needed him alive and cooperative to perfect their harvesting techniques. The revelation of the mining company's true intentions galvanized the small group into action. Dr. Ward quickly began preparing a medical solution to flush the remaining silver deposits from Gideon's system while Clementine gathered evidence to document the company's criminal operations. You can't prove anything, the foreman said. But his confidence was clearly shaken. And even if you could, who would believe such an outlandish story? Boone smiled grimly and pulled out a small notebook he'd been writing in throughout the conversation. Funny thing about keeping records. Every word you've said here today is written down along with the names and descriptions of every man who rode with you. The mining company men realized their situation had become untenable. They'd admitted to criminal exploitation of workers, conspiracy to commit murder, and theft of human tissue for commercial purposes. Even their corporate connections couldn't protect them from such serious charges. Dr. Ward finished his preparation and turned to Gideon. These will be painful, but it should flush out most of the remaining deposits before they can cause further complications. The natural rupture probably saved your life by relieving the internal pressure. As the treatment took effect, the wound on Gideon's leg began draining the last of the contaminated fluid. The silver fragments that emerged were noticeably smaller and less pure than the earlier samples, confirming Dr. Ward's theory that surgical intervention would have been both dangerous and ultimately futile. The foreman made one last attempt to salvage the situation. Even if you expose our operations, the legal proceedings will take years. Mr. Marsh will need ongoing medical care that only our facilities can provide. Actually, Clementine said with satisfaction, I've been documenting everything for the Territorial Medical Board. By this time tomorrow, every doctor in 3 territories will know about the Silver Peak Syndrome and how to treat it safely. Faced with certain exposure and prosecution, the mining company men reluctantly mounted their horses and departed. But their threat wasn't entirely empty. Corporate power and political influence could still make life difficult for anyone who opposed them. Over the following weeks, however, justice moved more swiftly than expected. Boone's detailed records, combined with Dr. Ward's medical evidence and Clementine's documentation, provided territorial authorities with everything needed to launch a full investigation. The mining company's political connections crumbled when faced with evidence of systematic murder for profit.